everyone. Welcome to another Happiness Index webinar. Hope you've all had a fabulous, summer holiday. And, if you've got kids, they're back to school and you've got a moment's peace. Today's webinar is on a slightly heavier topic than things we've covered previously, but an important topic nonetheless. And this is sort of coming just in time for World Suicide Prevention Day. So we're going to be looking today at freedom, safety, and the role of leadership in suicide prevention, especially in the workplace. For those of you who are just joining, who don't know who we are an employee engagement and happiness platform, providing surveys and insights into your culture at your organization. Basically, we use a neuroscience model to analyze all of our data and to look at sort of how the head and the heart work together to create a thriving culture. Today's panel, I'm very, very excited about. We've got two amazing guests. We've got Sally and Laura here, and I'm going to come out the slides so they can introduce themselves, but I hope you're as excited as I am. So. Right, let me just come out of here. Right, Sally, do you want to kick off and introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thank you so much, and thank you first of all for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be part of our conversation today. My name is Sally Desborough. I run an organisation called Your Wellbeing Hub, and we specialise in mental health and wellbeing training, so primarily mental health first aid, suicide first aid. We also write bespoke programmes as well for different clients, particularly with the line management population. That's proving to be a really popular area, but also for the broader population as well, so writing things from 1 hour to 1 day, depending on what the desired learning outcomes are. So that's a bit about me and my business. I used to work in HR, 11 years in the HR world. So worked with lots of different people, big kind of like generalist roles. So I got my teeth into all sorts of different bits and pieces, including kind of learning and development as well. I'm writing manager workshops there and supporting people experiencing challenges at work, both kind of physically and mentally, being part of the support system and all of that kind of fun stuff as well. So I really loved my time in HR, but kind of made this transition into mental health and wellbeing a few years ago now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Laura, do you want to give us a little spiel?
Of course. I'm Laura Page. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a people and happiness assistant at the Happiness Index. I'm just coming up to my 2-year quackiversary, as we call it. I've been with the Happiness Index now for almost 2 years. And like the roles that Sally had in HR, it's a very generalist one, doing everything HR related across the employee life cycle, and a lot to do with our culture, which is the happiness side of the role, and using our platform internally. So that's using I'm involved in our cultural assessments, and also using our version of employee voice, which is called Quokka Voice, which, for those of you who don't know, quokkas are supposedly the happiest animal on the planet. So it's what we call our employees. And I'm also a mental health first aider, because I did the mental health first aid training with Sally's wonderful company, Your Wellbeing Hub. So I also am quite involved with looking after the wellbeing of our quokkas at the Happiness Index.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. I'm Kashi, because my screen name right there says the Happiness Index. That's not my name. My name's Kashi. If you've been to one of our webinars before, you'll probably recognize me. I'm usually the one chatting and trying to, hold conversation together while I'm on screen with some amazing guests, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but here we are.
Don't believe it.
But yeah, so I mean, today we're tackling quite an important topic here. It's one that I don't think is talked about enough. Like, I think the mental health conversation has definitely stepped up a lot in the last few years. Like, I remember time ago that you couldn't really admit that you had any kind of mental health issues, in fear of it being a problem. You're not going to get anywhere in the workplace if people think you've got an issue. But a topic that's still not talked about much is suicide. and the risk factors, the things that can cause it, that can cause those kinds of ideations and things like that. So Sally, I was wondering if you could give us like a bit of a current like landscape of what mental health at work is like at the moment.
Yeah, I think everything you said there is so true around, there's so much stigma and taboo around this topic, and it is a difficult topic, and it can be triggering, and really important that we look after our safety when we're talking about this. When we're taking part in this webinar, we might need to just step away from it, and all of that's okay, because we know it can be triggering, it can be a very traumatizing event, and still something important that we do raise awareness of, because the figures aren't really changing. We see all this statistical information, it's not really changing, it's not really changed over the last few years. So lots of conversation, lots of awareness raising, but there is still so much to do, and it all needs to be followed by action. It's really good raising awareness and understanding these things, but how can we start making change through the actions that we do as well? What does the current landscape look like in terms of mental health at work? The Health and Safety Executive do a piece of research on a regular basis, and they published an article in 2022 that estimates that over 900,000 employees are experiencing some kind of work-related stress, anxiety, or depression. So a huge number of people, and we're seeing that rise kind of every year. Other research, 17% of employees struggle with a mental health condition. Okay, so that's almost 1 in 5 people experiencing that. So it's so important that we are equipped with being able to support one another in the workplace. People might not have a diagnosed mental health condition, but they might be experiencing emotional distress and pain that is going to impact them in some way, shape, or form at work as well. So being able to raise awareness, have early conversations. We know that suicide can be prevented. I'm not going to sit here and say that all suicides can be prevented. Of course, we'd like to get to 0, but that's not realistic. But most suicides can probably be prevented. And if we can have early conversations to try and prevent people from getting to that place, that's always going to be a good place to be. But still then, people may get to that place. How do we engage in conversations and keep people as safe as possible?
Absolutely. And then, Laura, in terms of like the landscape of mental health at work, have you noticed any sort of like, just in your role in general as well, like, have you noticed any sort of changes, any increases, any decreases in terms of what mental health has been like, even at the happiness index?
So I think we're really lucky that we do have a very open culture surrounding mental health, and people are very open about talking about when they're struggling. I think the pandemic both helped and hindered how equipped the workplace is to accommodate for people living with mental health, mental illnesses, and also going through mental health difficulties, whether they've experienced them before or not. I think at the Happiness Index, we are remote first. Before the pandemic, that was something that wasn't the case. We went into the office a lot more. We had our own office space. This was before I worked with the Happiness Index, but I know that was the case. And since the dramatic shift to home working that took place as a result of the pandemic, because we had no choice, we actually have shifted and evolved our culture. So we are now remote first, and we go into the offices less regularly. And I think that's had a huge impact on the mental health climate, and obviously varies from company to company, but it does just mean people are not spending as much time in person with people. So that has impacted people's mental health differently, some for the better, some for the worse. I think for people who live with mental health conditions, I think the ability to be more flexible has helped them to manage those conditions. It means that when you are having a low energy period because of a mental illness, or you're just needing to take extra precautions around, or extra measures to protect your boundaries, you have more flexibility to do that in a culture where you can choose whether you are going into the office or not. But it is a very, very individual. I think also not spending as much time in person with people can hinder people's mental health when they're
Definitely.
They get used to not being in person. So yeah, I think the shift in what's normal for our working culture has definitely impacted mental health in a number of different ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Sally, have you, in terms of in your organization, like post-pandemic, obviously things have shifted to a lot more hybrid and then remote culture. Yeah, what's your take on it, like in terms of the impact it's had on mental health and in terms of suicide prevention as well, like being able to reach out and have conversations?
Yeah, I think this hybrid working, it's now our reality, isn't it? I think it's going to be a constant for us all, and it's a common question around, well, how do we spot warning signs of poor mental health if we're working remotely? Because we might not see each other for 3 weeks if our diaries don't align. It's rare for the whole team to be in the office together. And so we have to be so much more purposeful in how we connect with one another, and just thinking about what those needs are and what our boundaries are as well. Some people, the team meeting once a week on the Monday morning is enough. For others, they need to touch point, twice a day. And it's about that confidence in being able to communicate what our needs are, because we are completely unique. We are also individual and nobody's psychic. Okay, so it's about being safe to communicate those needs. But in terms of having these conversations, we do have to be so much more proactive to be able to spot those signs. And also, I think, just naturalize and normalize the mental health conversation. If we're a people manager, spending a third of our one-to-ones at the beginning talking about how are you, how's life treating you, tell me about how's the wife, how's the kids, or whatever that is. I'm invested in you, and I'm going to spend 15 minutes of a 45-minute catch up just talking about you and your life and what's going on at the moment. And then let's get to the work stuff, because it is so easy to go into, right, the to-do list, the project, this, that, and the other. And then there's no time to really understand, well, how is somebody doing? And if we're not doing those conversations, we know cameras can mask so much. Our relationships are, face, neck and shoulders. And we might be able to pick up on some body language, a thin smile or a change in eye contact, but it's so much harder to detect. We can pick up on things in people's tone of voice, but if we're jumping straight into the work stuff, we may completely miss the opportunity to spot those signs. But how do we create how do we build and maintain relationships when we're working in a hybrid way? How do we make space for meaningful conversation? And I think we're all responsible for that. Managers manage people. For managers managing 15 people, it's going to be hard for them to make all of that happen. So how can we take responsibility to get in touch with one another and make sure those needs are being met by being proactive ourselves? From a mental health perspective, people have felt lonely, without a shadow of a doubt. People have felt lonely, and some people have felt, oh my goodness, I'm stuck in this house with my 3 kids running around. I really need to get out of the house. It's too much. I need some alone time.
Yeah.
So it's been so different for different people, and it's been such a massive transition, I think, for a lot of people. For the majority, some organisations were already, before 2020, they were already set up for hybrid working or remote working, and that's how they've always run. So not really a huge change for those, but I'd say for the majority of people it's kind of a big shift and a big adjustment.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's always really strange whenever I talk to people about the shift, because for me, I graduated and I finished uni in my last semester in lockdown 1. So when I finished uni, my entire working life has been hybrid and remote. Like, I've never had to go into an office. I've always worked from home. So it's so wild to me when I talk to people about having to go into an office every day. I'm like, wow, I'm kind of glad I missed out on that.
Never had to do that. And it's so amazing, because that is such a different experience. A lot of people are thinking, oh my goodness. And at the time, people talk about working from home, and it's like, well, we're working remotely whilst living in a really big, difficult situation at the moment. But this has been your normal.
This has been my entire everyone's like, oh, this is the new normal. I'm like, this is just normal.
New normal. I was never a fan of that phrase, not gonna lie. New normal. No,
I hate it.
It's our reality, and it might be reality for some people, but actually it might be. Yeah, absolutely.
There's a good point you make there, actually. I really hate the phrase new normal, because it's so and I was talking to a friend of mine about this, because she is a musician, she is disabled, she's chronically ill, and for her this is not a new normal. This is just everyone else's new normal, just means that they're not really taking into account the fact that she's still, you know, very, very terrified of leaving her house. And, you know, with any kind of illness, like, it's just wild to me. So yeah, it just really
and actually I think it's a really good point as well for the people who going into the office it's never been a normal for. Their needs are going to be completely different when they're in an environment when they're now being encouraged to come in a lot more, because that's going to be a very unfamiliar setup. I definitely can relate, Kashi, having similarly come into the workplace after the pandemic. I find my experience of being in the office is it can be very overstimulating and overwhelming and draining when it's something that's ever been normal.
Yeah, we can't underestimate that impact, can we?
Definitely.
Can't underestimate it because we're all so different.
Definitely. So if we get into the sort of nitty-gritty of it now, like in terms of when we're talking about suicide prevention in the workplace, if we're looking at it from like an organizational approach and how the role of leadership is going to come into that, what would you say is like an approach that people who are watching today can be mindful of, like in terms of things that you have to consider? How would we go about that?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it has to be a collective thing, no single individual. Yes, we can work on an individual, just put my teeth back in. We can work on an individual basis and support people and have appropriate conversations, but all levels need to be involved with this. If we're thinking about kind of leadership, you know, the strategy around wellbeing at work has to be there coming from top levels. And I think sometimes people think, oh, this is an HR initiative, you know, mental health and wellbeing. Actually, it needs to come from the top with support from HR. It absolutely needs to be a strategic priority, involved in the workplace conversation as well. So really championing mental health and wellbeing at work, talking about, you know, or having regular conversations about what makes us feel good and what makes us feel happy and how do we become engaged, and really championing that. And that will have a really strong ripple effect down an organisation to your senior managers, to your managers, so that they can engage in their conversations. And so people feel like individuals as well, not just a cog in the machine. If you feel like you're just being treated like everybody else, your needs aren't going to be met. You're not going to feel understood as an individual, and that's going to affect your motivation levels. You're probably not going to feel as happy. So from a leadership perspective, if that's a key priority and everyone's seeing that's a key priority, people are going to kind of believe it. If senior leaders and are seen to be looking after their own health and well-being, you're going to get more buy-in. Whereas if they're talking the talk, but not actually showing those behaviours around regular breaks, you know, not working 70-hour weeks, again, people are going to follow suit. Whereas actually, if they're saying this and then doing the 70-hour or 80-hour weeks and, you know, sending emails on a Sunday, well, people just aren't going to buy into it. So leadership do have a really strong influence here around building that culture of positive well-being. Try and prevent. Prevention is always better than cure, right? So we want to start with a prevention focus first and foremost. Openness, acceptance, understanding, you know, and yeah, just really encouraging the conversation around it. Focus on education, focus on training, that being really clear as well, you know, tackling myths, tackling stigma, normalizing mental health conversation, awareness of sources of workplace stress, impacts of bullying, impacts of harassment, having all of those policies in place and procedures to protect people as well. Having those escalation points would be really important. Celebrating diversity as a key priority as well, so people can bring their true selves to work and not have to hide any part of who they are or their identity. All of that's going to be so valuable there. And, you know, there's many things that can happen in people's lives that can contribute to poor mental health and lead people to, you know, thinking about suicide and doing suicide behaviour. How can we equip people with, knowledge? How can we ensure those one-to-ones are happening in the way that we want them to? How can we put those systems in place if somebody is experiencing poor mental health around, okay, you can speak to your line manager or a mental health first aider or a suicide first aider or our employee assistance program or your private medical insurance, because we can prevent, but we don't know what's going to happen in somebody's life either. So having all those systems in place from a prevention, protection, and then being able to support people if they do experience that poor mental health as well. Just having a clear policy and guidance. I think equally remembering that people are human too. Sometimes, with my HR background, sometimes people get stuck on the written word. Oh, well, our bereavement policy says you can have 3 days paid. Okay, well, this was my mum, so what do I do after those 3 days?
Yeah.
Or you have to take unpaid leave or book 2 weeks holiday to grieve my mum. Okay, so yes, we have this policy in place, but what's the right human thing to do? What feels right? I'm not sure 3 days, bereavement leave paid, and that's then exhausted, just doesn't feel right. So we have to remember that we're all human in all of this.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's quite a I don't know if that was a rant or not, but quite a lot there.
Do you know what? That was really good. Yeah, no, that completely answered, well, anything that I would have asked following up, to be fair. Laura, in terms of, everything that Sally's just said, like, one of the reasons why I really wanted you to be here on the panel today was because, obviously at the Happiness Index, we do talk a lot about mental health, we talk a lot about well-being, and obviously the entire point of what we're doing is to ensure that people can come to work as their authentic selves, the freedom to be human, motto that we have, and the idea of not having to wear that mask to work, that, taking off that mask, and if you're having a crap time at home, it's okay, like, that's okay. You can say that when you're at work. You don't have to leave that at the door, because that's part of what you're dealing with. So in terms of the things that Sally was saying there, like, would you say that these are things that you've been considering in your role? How have these things sort of shown up in what you do?
So I think from everything that Sally covered there, the really important thing that you highlighted is that there's not just one approach that you need to take for this to show up across your entire culture. It needs to be something that is completely embedded in your company's DNA, and who you are, what your values are as an organization, and the fact that everybody throughout that those values permeate throughout the organization and are shared by everyone who's part of it. Obviously that's a lot easier said than done. So I think it's not just about leaders preaching certain values or saying that it's what you believe in, so we talk about freedom to be human at the Happiness Index. That's our vision, that's what we want to help. That's our goal for not just our own organization, but for all of our customers who use our platform, and all of the working world in a dream scenario. And we want the humanity of employees to be recognised, and the fact that they have mental health, that is not always going to be is going to fluctuate. So I think the important thing is that you're checking in with your culture and what you're doing to provide support in all of those areas.
I mean, in terms of like what we do at the Happiness Index, like we have like quite a few different channels of support, which I always find really useful. And in terms of what Sally you're saying there about it coming from the top down, I'd say like our 3 co-founders, Matt, Tony, and Chris, they are really, really good at sort of being really open and talking about their mental health. Would you say, Laura?
Yeah, I think having leaders that are willing to speak about their own mental health is really good for setting the tone. For what is okay to talk about is that authenticity piece, and showing that from the top almost gives permission for everybody to follow suit.
Absolutely.
I think a tool that's really helpful to what I was saying before about how Sally's really highlighted the fact that it needs to be something that happens across a whole organisation. So we use our cultural assessment, which helps to dig down into the roots and look at how we're supporting all of those happiness factors. So I think when we're talking about mental health, that's the side of our neuroscience triangle that's to do with happiness. So we look at themes like safety and balance, and those things are really connected to your mental health. A lot of the things that Sally mentioned were to do with sort of your boundaries, and the fact that it's not just about how you're supported at work, but the fact that your personal life is going to impact your mental health too. And obviously your organization doesn't control those external factors that will influence how you're feeling and how you show up at work, but they can accommodate for the fact that they're going to be there and provide an environment where you're safe to express those things and not feel like things impacting you in your personal life end when you open your laptop and start work.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And our cultural assessment is a survey, but the idea is to gain a kind of sense check for how you're doing in all of those different areas. And then when, for example, it shows up, or if it was to be highlighted that safety or mental health was a recurring theme in the feedback that you're getting, that's a really good way of then digging deeper into that issue and looking where you can make changes to improve things.
Yeah.
But that's just one channel. Again, I think the fact that you have multiple channels to listen and to hear what's going on and understand whether there's more that you can do to support mental health
absolutely
is really important. And obviously I've mentioned our platform and the surveys is one form of doing it, but Sally also mentioned the importance of the role of leadership, of line managers, of employee assistance programs. I think so many things came up in what Sally said.
Just went off on one, I'm sorry.
No, but it's also important. It's also important. So yeah, there's no one single solution or one thing. Yeah, you need to think about the whole picture.
Yeah, and I love this piece around sharing vulnerability as well at leadership levels. I think sometimes people underestimate how powerful that is, and again, that positive rippling impact. And sometimes organizations aren't there yet, but bringing a speaker to come in and talk about their vulnerabilities. So as a starting point, okay, if it's not happening, if we're maybe a little bit behind on the whole mental health and well-being topic, how else can we try to create that safety? What is our starting point? And I hear it all the time in my courses where, do you know what I find is sometimes when I share with somebody that I've struggled a little bit, all of a sudden I've got 5 people talking to me about their struggles and their worries. That probably wouldn't have happened. So we can't underestimate that. And this piece around boundaries as well, I think so important. We are responsible for looking after ourselves. We do need to make proactive and positive choices to make sure that we are managing our boundaries and prioritising that mental health and well-being. Again, for people working remotely, broadly, who have been in the office and then had to work remotely, a real struggle to manage kind of like finishing at 6 and not being tempted to work through to 8 because actually I'm not leaving the office anymore. I've just got to walk out of this room and I'll be type thing. And so really being so strict, and that's been hard. That's been a big kind of transition and change for a lot of people as well. So yes, we have a responsibility ourselves, but we know how much the environment in which we work plays a huge part in how we feel every day as well. So, if we are working in an environment where culturally it is, 70 hours a week, how are we ever going to foster positive mental health and well-being? Because our bodies and minds aren't designed to do that. We're not built to be living under chronic stress. That's not how our bodies and minds were kind of built. So I kind of think about all these statistics and, well, is it any wonder? Because there is so much pressure, there's so much worry, there's so much concern, there's so much we're aware of going on in the world, and it's on a lot of people's minds, as well as working full-time, managing children and all that kind of stuff. So there is so much that we can do individually, but organisationally as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that piece around the boundaries of you're not having to go catch a train to go home now. You are having to stand up and walk out of, I don't know, your living room, your office, your bedroom, wherever you're working at home. And it is really, really hard to draw that line. Like, I remember in a previous job, I was working with students, I was working with young people, and I was working with people from underrepresented groups. So a lot of vulnerable young people, young students who were looking for work, I was doing sort of like careers work, and my work did not stop once 5:30 hit. Like, I was always pretty much on call, like answering emails at like 11 at night, and on Zoom with students who were rushing to get applications in till like 7:30, and like not eating dinner till like 10 minutes before I needed to go to bed or whatever. And I noticed what an impact it had on my mental health, and I was happy to do it because I cared about the people that I was working with, but I also was like, I'm giving from an empty cup now, and that's not sustainable at all. And now here I'm like, okay, cool, 5:30, peace, I'm switching off, I'm shutting down now, bye. And I think because of that culture of encouraging rest, and encouraging balance, it's had such an incredible impact.
Yeah, and I think it's this word sustainable, isn't it? Sustainability. And I've worked with organisations, but we're high performing culture. Well, yes, but surely you want that in a sustainable way. If you've got people burning out for a couple of years, they might be off sick for 6 months to 18 months. Surely you want to be thinking about, yes, we're a high performing culture, but we must achieve this in a really sustainable way. And sometimes organizations kind of think, well, if we are encouraging breaks, and what if they are working shorter days, not going to achieve as much? Well, however, actually the long-term picture is a much more positive and healthy one. I think it's the sustainable bit that's so important.
Definitely.
I also think there are two really interesting things that came up from what you just said, and I'd be interested to hear what your perspective on this is, Sally. One, I think what you were saying, Kashi, about the fact that you really cared about what you were doing before, and like you were saying, Sally, when you're working from home, it's really easy for when you don't have to leave the office and you're really engrossed in what you're doing, you really care. I guess it's like the engagement side of our model, that like engagement with the work you're doing, the passion for what you're doing. It's sometimes you might not want to stop, like you might be so engaged but not realize the impact it's having to your detriment in terms of your mental health, and the emptying of that cup, as you put it, Kashi. And the other thing, I guess, obviously in the work that we're doing at the Happiness Index, we're working a more conventional 9 to 5:30 typically. Obviously we've got some flex there, but we do work during normal working hours, and there are some jobs, some industries, some expectations in different roles where you don't have that luxury, you don't have the privilege of being able to turn off the laptop at 5:30. And I suppose different levels of seniority as well, there might be a bit more expectation that you are more on call at different times. So I just wondered what your perspective on those kind of situations is, Sally.
Yeah, so I think on the first one, it's really easy to forget ourselves, and we all do it. We put everybody else first and then we forget ourselves. And it's really common, especially when we're so engaged and we're enthusiastic and we want to do a good job and we're really conscientious. And it's sometimes those people you have to keep an eye on the most, or even the quiet people who just get on and crack on with things. Those are sometimes the people you have to keep an eye on, because they will work and work and work because they want to do a good job, they want to perform, they want to make a difference and all those kind of good things. And that's how I became unwell. I just kept going and going and going, working too much. And when life settled, that's when I completely took a nosedive and became unwell. And I think, with those boundaries, doing something as simple as, in your diary at 5:30, I finish work now, and that popping up. And if our diary is shared with other people, then we're more likely to commit to it, and we're more likely to have a positive rippling impact on those around us as well. So something as small as diarising everything, diarising your lunch, diarising your morning coffee break, because again, if you're in your office upstairs and the kitchen is downstairs and I'll just get this done, or I'll just get that done, or I'll just get this done, you just end up working through all your breaks, and at 3 o'clock you're thinking, why do I feel so rubbish? I've got really heavy head and feel a bit blurry-eyed, and everything's feeling a bit heavy. Oh, and I'm starving. Oh, and I've not been for a wee yet. Oh, because it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I've actually not moved from my desk. So just something as simple as, just diarising everything. And I think sometimes people think, oh my goodness, that's so much effort, but spending 15 minutes doing that in the morning, you're going to be much more productive by taking those breaks. Again, I think we're tricked into, I'll just work and work and work, and things will just get done. And actually we're more likely to feel fatigued, we're more likely to make errors, we're more likely to find it much harder to make decisions in the afternoon. So really, I think we do forget ourselves, so we must put ourselves first, we must prioritize ourselves first, because people aren't going to do it for us. So I think, learning to manage boundaries, and that's something I chatted with a lot. Okay, I don't have a commute anymore. My commute was half an hour on the train, so what am I going to do for half an hour in the morning? Rather than just brush my teeth and switch my laptop on, actually I'll brush my teeth. What I've done for half an hour, okay, maybe I'll sit in the garden and just drink a cup of tea for half an hour. Maybe I'll go for a walk, maybe I'll do a bit of yoga or something like that, just to try and create some kind of commute that we no longer had access to. The second point, what was the second point you said? I can't remember now.
Good question.
It was sorry, I remember. It was
Thanks,
on
Kathy.
I think it was on the kind of people who don't have the luxury of switching off at 5:30, people who work in late shifts, work long hours, that kind of thing.
Okay, so that expectation, and some people, you're right, some people don't necessarily have the autonomy to decide when they're taking breaks, if they can start at 9:30 instead of 9, or whatever, and that can be really hard. So we know that feeling autonomous in our work helps to build resilience, it helps to reduce stress, but we know, for example, people working in a call centre, they have to put themselves on code when they're going to the loo, when they come back from the loo, when they go to lunch, they have to put themselves on code. There are it's quite a restrictive environment in which people work. So I think it's about that awareness, being aware of that risk as an organisation, thinking about the assessment around that, and how do we create safety in other ways if people don't have that autonomy. For example, the expectation around being available at 10 o'clock at night. Again, I've worked with organisations where the client emails in, they work in America, so at 2 p.m. on a Friday, it might be 7 p.m. or it could be 5 p.m. their time, 10 p.m. our time, and the expectation is to just jump up and respond. So you might have somebody in the UK having to log on a Friday night at 10 o'clock because the client in the US, and again, organisationally, how do we manage that to say to clients, you are very important to us. However, we also need to manage this time difference and things like that, and be realistic, because if people are having to log on at 10 o'clock at night, having already worked a full week, that's not going to be helpful. So I think there is an organisational responsibility. And again, it's really hard for people, if your senior leaders are doing that, how do I get to senior lead levels? Okay, I have to log on at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. Yeah, it's just not going to be helpful or healthy. And is it sustainable? This is what we need to come back to.
Absolutely.
Is it sustainable for people to keep doing this? What balance are people experiencing in their work and lives? And again, we do have this responsibility, but some people may not feel like they can talk about it. Well, it comes back to safety then. Why do people not feel safe to actually share, I don't feel comfortable having to log on at 10 o'clock at night? That is my time, I need my boundaries between work and life.
Yeah, definitely.
Some work that we've done recently in that area, because the Happiness Index are a tech company where we work with different people across the world on different time zones, and sometimes things go wrong with the tech, and we have had in the past the odd occasion where people need to jump on something at a time that's not in during our UK working hours. So we've been working on a time off in lieu policy. I know a lot of different companies do time off in lieu, but we've been really trying to bake our cultural values into that, and I think trying to encourage people to recognise that they have the permission to protect their boundaries. Obviously, in those situations, they're having to give up time. Then there might be a one-off occasion where they have to give up time outside of that, but we've really encouraged them to make sure that they're taking that time back for themselves and giving them permission, and trying to encourage them to feel safe to do that, and to not expect then expect that to be a norm for them. If they have to do it on the one-off, it should just be a one-off. It shouldn't be something that they're normalizing, and then I think it can become a habit if it happens occasionally or a few times, and you're like, okay, this oh well, that means I can just work a little bit longer, or work a couple of hours at the weekend to finish off this task. But we've made it really clear in our guidelines around this that shouldn't be the case. Nobody expects that of you, and we encourage you not to expect that of yourself either, which I guess ties back into that the piece about people being really engaged and caring to the point that they're working above and beyond what we expect, what the organisation expects of them, because they're putting that expectation on themselves. So we've been really trying to encourage people to build those boundaries for themselves, as well as give them the tools from us to help with it.
Yeah.
It's that give and take relationship. It's a two-way relationship, isn't it? It's not the organisation saying, right, work till 10, but I expect you back in your normal hours. Actually take a couple of hours in the morning.
Yeah.
You know, if you had to log on at 10 o'clock and had to work for half an hour, for you to, you know, jump up off your sofa, and you know, the adrenaline could be running as well. If you've got people, the tech's not working, it needs to be working, get it fixed. What can we gift people in terms of the next day? Just take a couple of hours. If you want to log on at 12, we'll see you at 12, you know, that kind of thing. Treat like adults, isn't it? It's an adult relationship ultimately.
Exactly. I feel like a lot of the time, and like historically within the workplace, it kind of feels a bit like school. Like I feel I've quite often, like in previous jobs, like felt like I've been treated a bit like, I mean, obviously I was probably the youngest on the team at that point, probably was feeling like a child, but like, you know what I mean? Like, treat me like an adult. I'm old enough to be working. I pay my taxes. I do all my stuff. Like I come to work. I expect to be treated like I'm an employee. Like I am competent, and you hired me to do this job. So why don't you trust me to just get on with it? So, you know, if it means being flexed with some hours, what difference does it make? And I think, you know, that kind of approach to work of like, we need to have policies and we need to have things that are like a one size fits all, and it's so not applicable. It's not possible. We are all completely different, and it's like having a one size fits all never works, because it's not going to work for everyone. It's never going to work for everyone. Do you know what I mean? And I think that kind of just using common sense and taking it case by case is just needs to be a blanket standard.
And you know what, it's really interesting that you both bring it back to that kind of adult child dynamic, because I think it's not even necessarily about being an adult, it's about being a human being, which is what we're about. And this is kind of a slight tangent, but it's something that I get really frustrated with from an education point of view, because I think often kids are treated like kids, not human beings, and like we've got this idea that you need that because they're a child they need to be told a little bit more. And my sister, for example, she's suffered with some really challenging mental health difficulties through her time in education, and she knows and she's learned what the boundaries that she needs are, but because she's a child and the school has an idea of what their expectation is, and so for example like how much she needs to be in school, like what the expectation for attendance is, but actually for her she cannot always be in school because of her mental health challenges and the disability that she's living with. And I think it's the same for the workplace, and it gives me so much hope seeing cultures like the Happiness Index and other organisations that are becoming so much more flexible, inclusive, open about the very individual human needs that people have, because it's about being human and about being different, and those needs are not going to be the same for everybody. So sorry, I've slightly gone on a tangent, but I think it comes back to the point that we started with about people's humanity and recognizing individual human needs.
Definitely. And I think, you know, if we're linking this back into the suicide prevention topic, when those needs aren't being met, you know, that's when these mental health issues and problems can arise. And in terms of from like because obviously our audience, a majority sort of HR, ED&I and internal comms people. So what can they be looking out for? Like, are there any sort of warning signs and factors that can increase risk that people who are watching can be like, right, cool, I'm just going to keep that in the back of my head just as a thing, for people who are going to do the one-to-ones, are these things that they could be thinking about?
So, I mean, warning signs, there are lots of potential warning signs when it comes to poor mental health and suicide as well. The thing that we always look for is a change in the person. So whenever you see a change in somebody, that might just you might just start thinking about, starting a conversation with somebody and checking in to make sure they're okay. If somebody's really in that low ebb where they've started to think about suicide, that most people do give at least one warning sign. So if we are aware to this, again, not everybody will give a warning sign, but most people do give at least one warning sign. So it can be, there's lots of myths when it comes to suicide prevention. Somebody could be talking about suicide. They could be talking that they're thinking about it. And sometimes people think, oh, they're attention seeking. No, anyone talking about it has to be absolutely taken seriously, because it is a massive warning sign. People do want help, but they just don't know if it's safe to talk about. So somebody might make a joke, might be laughing about it. Any mention of it, we have to take absolutely seriously. It's not attention seeking behavior in any way, shape or form. Even if somebody says it in a moment of anger, we have to take it seriously. It might be that somebody's become a lot more quiet. You might see kind of like extreme mood changes and things like that. Somebody might have been unwell for a long time, so we might be supporting somebody experiencing poor mental health, and all of a sudden they seem a lot better very, very quickly. Okay, that can be a warning sign. Nobody recovers overnight. Nobody recovers in 2 weeks. Somebody's been unwell for a number of months, and all of a sudden over a couple of week period, they seem a lot better. Could be over the course of a week or a couple of days. That can be a warning sign as well. There's no such thing as a sudden recovery. Okay, so that can be a warning sign as well. And I think that's where suicide can be quite shocking, is people say, oh, they were back to their usual self. They were, going out and meeting up with people and whatever else, and then they've taken their own life or they've attempted suicide. So that's something definitely to be aware of. Somebody might be saying goodbye. They might be sorting financial affairs in order, talking about, oh, I'm just going to get my will sorted out. That might seem to be out of the blue. Some people give their belongings away as gifts as well.
The declarations of love, almost like that kind of, it's almost like that kind of unspoken goodbye of being really loving to your friends and your family, and being like, oh, telling them how much you appreciate them, all that kind of stuff. Can definitely be
a slightly longer hug that is unusual for this person, but actually it's quite nice. A bit out of the ordinary, but actually it's quite nice.
You're like, oh, it's like it used to be or something, but actually it can be a warning sign. It
can be a warning sign. So some are really hard to detect, some are really, really discreet, and some might be a little bit more obvious around escalating risk-taking behaviour, somebody putting themselves in dangerous situations, complete social withdrawal, that sudden improvement as well. Somebody might also be apologising. So if somebody, fell out with somebody 5 years ago, they might actually reach out and say, I'm really sorry for the way that things were left a few years ago. Before that time, I really appreciated our friendship. And that's almost a way of saying goodbye as well. Changes in performance, sudden drop in performance, changes to social functioning, eating changes, sleeping changes. Somebody might be on edge. They might be quite anxious or agitated as well. There are so many potential warning signs. Listening to people's language as well. Sometimes people talk in code. So listening to people, I feel like I'm such a burden to everybody around me. I feel trapped. Sometimes I wish I wouldn't wake up in the morning. There's no way out. I don't see a positive end to this current situation. We're going to need to just listen out to language that people might be using as well.
Absolutely. And
those are some examples. There are plenty of warning signs of poor mental health and warning signs for suicide. Again, not everybody will show a warning sign, but the majority of people do, and we only need to see one warning sign to have some kind of concern about how somebody is.
Definitely.
Did you ask about factors that might increase risk as well?
Yeah.
So I would say really anything that happens in somebody's life where you think, oh gosh, that could be really painful for that person.
Yes.
So that could be a job loss, a bereavement, a relationship breakdown. Somebody could be injured. Somebody could receive a diagnosis of an illness. It might be that somebody's received a diagnosis of a mental health condition. We know that undiagnosed depression is a major risk as well. So somebody may not be living with a diagnosis, but be experiencing poor mental health. Somebody who's bereaved, and particularly bereaved by suicide, massive risk as well. We know that men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women broadly.
Yep.
LGBT plus community at an increased risk as well, potentially. Again, stigma, discrimination, hate crime, bullying, all of those kind of things could increase risk. Suicide is the biggest killer in new mums in the first year as well. It's not something that people think about, but you know, postnatal depression, that experience, big life change to relationships, expectations, you know, seemingly positive life events can be a massive risk as well. And it's something that we mustn't overlook. But yeah, any kind of situation where you think, well, that could be really painful for this person, how's this affecting them, what does this feel like for them, and trying to be as understanding and engaging in those conversations, and being non-judgmental as well. I think that's the biggest thing, is not being judgmental when we are engaging in conversations, because it will just shut down. And yeah, absolutely.
And I think, you know, especially with like conversations around suicide, people can be quite judgy. People can be really judgy about, you know, if you bring it up and you know, taking it back to that attention seeking point, you know. And it's like, if someone's bringing to you the idea that they want to take their own life, or hinting, or you know, giving any of those warning signs, how can you take it as attention seeking, you know? And even if you are thinking about it like that, good, yes, give it attention, you know. That is a clear warning sign, a cry for help. Yes, give it some attention, because it needs it.
Or it's that response of, but you've got so much to live for.
Oh my god. I hate that.
I mean, you got your family, you got your kids, you got the car, you got the house, you got the dream job. What, you've got nothing to worry about. Thanks for that. That's really helpful.
That helps. That cures it all.
That's not a choice. You know, it's not a choice that people, oh yeah, okay, I'll just stop thinking about taking my own life then. I hadn't thought of all those wonderful things. I'm very aware of this, but this is how I'm feeling. And
literally, like I feel like I remember it was like a school counsellor or something, and I struggle with hormonal depression and anxiety, and I'm on medication for it now. But for me, like, I remember at school, this was way before I was diagnosed or anything, and my school counsellor was like, I was talking to her about how I was having a really bad depressive episode, and she was like, have you been for a walk? And I was like, hun, I can't get up and brush my teeth, let alone go for a walk. Like, I need small wins here. But like, it's things like that, like those little digs that can be really harmful, even if you are meaning it with good intention.
Yeah, and when you're unwell in that way anyway, you do tend to focus on the things that you're not doing.
Yeah,
like being able to
be hard on ourselves.
Yeah, and actually we do need to focus on those small wins. When I was unwell, I remember reading, I was trying to get all sorts of guidance. I read online that somebody just write down everything that you do every single day, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to do that. And then I did start doing it. I just broke life down so much into, you know, the fact that I pulled the duvet off myself and I managed to sit up and get my feet on the floor. That's like 3 steps. Oh, I've done 3 things already today. And I've managed to actually stand up and walk into the bathroom and wash myself. Holy moly. Well, you know, that was amazing, because actually, you know, when you break it down, well, you have to switch on the tap, you know, you have to, you know, get the water running, get the soap, you know, wash yourself down. When you break life down, that's like, that could be 15 steps, and no different to, you know, making a cup of tea of actually, okay, I've made it to the kitchen, I've walked across the kitchen, I've opened a cupboard door, I've reached up, I've got a mug out, I've now shut the cupboard door, I'm now walking over to the kettle. The kettle, I'm taking the lid off and I'm putting, do you know what I mean? When you break it down, there's probably about 30 steps to making a cup of tea, but we don't actually recognize that, because it's just a simple thing to do. When you're really poorly and you break it down and you see that you've done actually 100 things because you've broken everything down, you have that sense of achievement, and that makes things feel good. And you may not have made the cup of tea, but actually you filled the, you know, the kettle with water and you boiled it, but you didn't get to making the tea. Well, I still had some wins, because up until
absolutely
things, so easy to focus on things that you haven't achieved. I
actually think as well, having these kind of conversations and listening and being exposed to these conversations is so valuable, because I mean, I also live with anxiety, and hearing you guys talking there, like I really recognize the feelings that you're describing, and like I think when you are in that headspace, breaking things down and framing them more positively really is like how it is a coping strategy. But if you haven't lived with mental illness or not been through had a mental health difficulty or period of like that, it can be really hard to empathize and understand the headspace that those people are in, or the person is in. So just educating yourself and trying to understand, step out of your own frame of reference and think about what they're actually going through at that time is so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think empathy is a skill that can be learned. And if we don't have that experience, listening, reading, learning, really trying to understand, just taking that time to build your knowledge, awareness, understanding what it can really feel like for people.
Yeah.
You know, we can start to learn to be empathetic.
Definitely.
That's what we need.
Yeah, it's important to stay curious as well. Like, I was having this conversation with my best friend the other day, and she was sort of talking to me because she was like, we were talking about how we don't understand how people are curious, because we're both, I don't know if you'd call it nosy or if you'd call it interested, but we're both people. I love to know more about people. I'm always like, give me the deets, tell me about your life, tell me everything. Like, but I love to learn more about other things through other people's experiences. So, for example, she was like saying to me how when I told her that I had endometriosis, she went online, she looked it up, she read about it, she went on forums, she did all this learning by herself. She never told me about it, but because she was like, I want to educate myself on something that you're dealing with so I can understand the shoes that you walk in. And I think if we were all a bit more like that, and we all sort of, you know, kind of learn a bit more about how other people see the world, it would be so much easier. Like, that's literally it. That's all you've got to do. Everyone watching, that's all you've got to do. Just be curious about people.
It's kind of interesting because even in itself, like being curious about how other people see the world, even the fact that you and your friend are curious in a way that other people aren't, is showing that difference in the way that you see the world or how you approach the world. I don't know if that makes sense, but like even the fact that she went off and did that research, that shows quite a lot about how her brain works. The fact she did it like under the radar, she just went away and
and it was really validating as well to hear that, like to hear that someone I care about was like, oh, I want to know how this affects you, and you know what struggles you might be dealing with so that I can be mindful. And I was like, oh my god, that's actually like so sweet. Like, it just felt really like, oh, it's nice to make people feel cared about in that way. Do you know what I mean? And I think, you know, from an organizational perspective, if you're doing training, if you're doing, you know, having these conversations and you're opening up these spaces, people as a whole want to feel cared about. We are social creatures. We are people. We are community people. We want to feel loved. We want to feel wanted. We want to feel needed. And when those things aren't happening, bad things happen. And you know, everyone deserves to be here. Everyone should be here, and we should be really striving to make sure people feel like they should be.
Yeah, and I think it does bring it back to these conversations. If somebody's experiencing poor mental health, if somebody is thinking about suicide, and that response is, oh, but you've got so much to live for, or whatever. Again, coming back to this place of curiosity, tell me more about what's going on for you.
Yeah.
Let's be curious. Let's ask rather than making that judgmental thing. Actually, I want to understand this person's shoes. What are they walking right now? How does it feel for them? How can I validate? You know, this is what we want to feel. Like you said, we want to feel understood. We want to feel reassured, validated, and not judged. We want to feel connected.
Yes.
And that's what it all comes back to, because that's how we were built. So yeah, just being curious when we're engaging in conversations about, you know, how are you feeling at the moment, and you know, what are you comfortable to share with me? Tell me about, you know, work, tell me about life. How long has this been going on for? Have you ever felt this way before? You know, what kind of support were you able to access at that point? Is there anything that I can do to support you? So all of this is always going to be helpful, because it's giving people the space, the safe space and the time to really get things off their chest and feel supported and connected.
Yeah. And in that, sorry, and in that, the way that you sort of described having that conversation, like, so say for example, Laura, someone comes to you and, or maybe they don't even come to you, but you sort of notice a warning sign or so that someone is not feeling their best, they're feeling quite low, maybe they have a history of mental health issues, that kind of thing, maybe they are beginning to have those kinds of suicidal ideations. How would we approach that conversation with someone? Like, how do you, like, you know, obviously you can't really just, I mean, I don't know, but I feel like it would probably do more harm than good to just sort of pull someone into a room and be like, hey, this is what's going on here, and like interrogate them. But how would we approach that conversation so that they know that you are clocked on, you are here, you're open, but without being too like in their face, I guess. Sorry, that was my lack of phrasing, was just like
oh, well, I think Sally gave some really good examples of questions that you could ask then, but actually the mental health first aid training course is a really, breaks it down really well into, I think it's the algae approach, which, have I got that right, Sally? So this is going to test my memory now. So it's about approaching the person and finding a way to do that in a non-confrontational, safe space. So it's listening non-judgmentally to what they have to say, like making sure that you're really listening to them. And I guess that's where the empathy piece comes in. You're not thinking about what you want to hear, you're actually listening to what they have to say. And giving them a safe space to do that. ALG is giving support and advice. It's been a while since I did this.
Not advice, we don't give advice.
No advice.
Information. Because in the other states, we're not mental health experts and qualified to give people advice.
Good point. And then the 2 E's are about encouraging them to seek support. And I think the first one is professional support. So it might be that you have, from the perspective of an HR professional. So at the Happiness Index, we use a company called CareCoins, which offer talking therapy. So that's one of the things that one of the places we'd signpost people. We also have a pool of resources and helplines that we direct people towards for in a crisis. And there are lots of other, there's a big manual that you get if you do the mental health first aid training course that helps, that gives you lots and lots of resources that you can draw on. And then also encouraging people to make small changes to their life that that maybe aren't seeking professional support, but that can help them in the situation that they're in. Is that the right?
Yeah, the kind of self-led wellbeing approach is under that second D. So again, those small things of breaking down life into small goals, speaking to family, friends, people that you trust. There might be like an informal support group locally, or you might find a Facebook group where people have lived experience. So it's really about using the community and your social connections to be able to support your level of wellbeing. Because again, we are social creatures. When we become unwell, we maybe become completely socially withdrawn. So having that well-established network around a person. So that's more kind of informal resources. Recovery is quicker for those who feel supported. So if you've got that well-planned support network around a person, you know, professionally, clinically, at work, you know, through your line managers, HR teams, occupational health, but then also in your personal lives as well, through your friendship groups and community, that's going to be better for people because it tackles the stigma, tackles the isolation. It gives, you know, it empowers people to make positive choices about their life and start to feel a little bit more in control of what's going on as well. I think it's really important to note too that, you know, we might be engaging in this conversation and we might be recognizing warning signs for suicide. If somebody's really desperate, they might start just talking about that. For others, they might find it really hard to talk about on the basis that there's a lot of stigma and taboo attached. And if I say it, I don't know how this person is going to receive it. I don't know if I've got permission to actually talk about these really deep and dark feelings. And I think it's a really big myth in suicide prevention as well that, well, if I ask them, does it increase any kind of risk? And it doesn't. And this is where we know that if we ask somebody if they're, are you thinking about suicide? I'm going to ask you a big question. Have you been thinking about taking your own life? We don't add any risk to that person in any way, shape or form. Some people might think, oh, is that not a bit triggering? But if we don't ask, we're never going to know. And that means that person could continue to be potentially at risk with nobody else knowing. So asking that question can be a really massive gift. And I always say, follow your gut feeling. So if you're spotting warning signs, if somebody's using language and you think, if I leave this room without asking, am I going to be thinking about it all day? Am I going to sleep tonight? I just don't know. Well, if it's good practice to ask and it doesn't add any kind of level of risk, then you can ask, and somebody might respond with no, and you believe them and you leave that meeting thinking, okay, I asked and I was satisfied with their answer. And somebody might respond no. You read their body language, read their tone, you might have to ask again, and that's okay. But just being yourself in that, being authentic, being open, listening, as Laura said, that's the biggest part of it, just listening non-judgmentally. It's take the time to be curious, ask some open questions, allow them to get the pain off their chest. And then through that, they'll probably feel a little bit more hopeful that actually the intensity of what they've been feeling has probably dipped. Even if it was a 9 out of 10 intense and they've moved to an 8 out of 10, that is an improvement, which is good.
And I think something I really took from the mental health first aid training course, and I would massively recommend it to organisations, make sure you have mental health first aid trained people throughout your organisation, and plug for Sally's as well, because Sally's course was brilliant. But I think the thing that really stood out to me was just how direct you are in that conversation when it comes to suicide. And I have actually had to use that with people both in my professional role and in my personal life. Like, there have been conversations I've had where that training has come to me, and it's okay to say, have you thought about ending your life? Have you made a plan? And be that specific. And it isn't something that's always comfortable and natural, because there is probably that internalized stigma around the topic, but just how powerful that is in those situations. So thank you, Sally.
Definitely. Yeah, and if any of you are interested in the course that Sally runs and some more information about your Wellbeing Hub, we will include all of that in the follow-up email from this webinar, and we'll have lots of information and resources and stuff for you all. We are coming to the end of our time, and just to round off, one thing we always like to do is ask our guests one thing that makes them happy. So one thing can be anything, can be food, can be a piece of music, can be a thing that you do, can be an animal, can be anything.
It's difficult to pick one though, isn't it? Goodness me. Loads of things make me happy. Playing netball is probably a big thing that makes me feel happy. Playing netball when I don't get injured. Had a couple of injuries recently.
Oh no.
Non-contact sport, would you believe? But oh yeah, playing netball, just it gets rid of the cobwebs after a stressful day. You're in it, you're with the girls, you're having a laugh, a little bit of competition, maybe pop into the pub afterwards as well.
Love it.
Big part of my life.
Love it.
It's a good one. For me, I'm gonna there are lots of things, but I'm gonna go with trees. Love trees. I always say trees. I love watching the transition of trees through the seasons as they change. I love getting out and about in nature. I think especially when I'm having a tough time with my mental health, I call it tree therapy. I just need to be near trees. I need to get out, go for a walk, just be near them. My ultimate dream for the future is to live near a wood, so I can have endless access to trees, and tree-filled joy.
Do you ever just go stick your head, like, the trees that are like quite close to the ground, or like, large bushes and hedges and stuff? Do you ever just go and like lie underneath and just look up through the branches? Because honestly, it is like the most amazing feeling. And I had no idea until I tried it. And then I was like, wow, it's like a whole new world up there.
Love this. I'm gonna have to add that to my self-care practices, I think. Yeah. I did hug a tree not that long ago when I was kind of like really in a bad place with hormones and stuff. So I did hug it. My partner and I were walking past a tree, and I was just really struggling to kind of pull myself out. With all my other self-care practices, I had to tap into something new. And he said, and we've got this favourite tree where we live. And so I said, why don't you why don't you hug the tree? So I was hugging the tree, and then I didn't want to let go of the tree. It's like, we really need to go now, Sally. I was like there for 10, 15 minutes. It's like, Sally, we really need to get back. And I'm like, I don't want to let go of the tree. It was almost like there's like an electric connection to this tree. I just didn't want to let go of it. It was incredible. It was incredible.
Oh,
So don't underestimate.
honestly, they're amazing.
I love that.
My dad always calls me a tree hugger. We always have a joke in my family that I'm a tree hugger. And for my birthday one year, they gave me one of the trees in our garden, and they put a sign on it saying Laura's tree. Just like they laminated a piece of paper and just put it. Sadly, that tree has been chopped down, which is a bit sad. So
we need to plant you a new one, Laura.
Yeah. Plant two.
I think they call it forest bathing. There's like a Japanese name for it. There's so much research about how good it is for your well-being, and also they're fascinating the way that they're part of these big interconnected networks under the ground.
They're like people.
They're like people. So I use trees as not just my therapy, but my source of inspiration.
Well, in this follow-up email, we'll include some information about trees as well. But yeah, I love it. I love it so much. Well, thank you both so much for your time. This has been so valuable. Yeah, I can't thank you enough. This was so interesting, and I'm sure everyone watching has found this really useful. But yeah.
Thank you. I've loved it. Do you know what? I could talk for another hour.
Yeah, honestly, same. I could talk for England, but I wish
We're limited by time.
Wicked. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for watching.
Take care. Cheers.
Take care.